Rubber Von Ducker here.
Today I'm looking at the Fox-Disney merger. Over the last year or so, a lot of people have said that the Fox-Disney merger was a terrible merger for Disney. Something I generally agreed with at the time. But recently, with everything that's going on, I thought, well, let's have a look. Let's see how bad it really was for Disney and whether we can attribute some of the problems Disney are having with this merger. So the first thing I'm going to look at is the general financials for the company. And here we've got the last 3 years annual figures. First one we've got is for revenue. So in 2017, 2018, they made 59 billion in revenue, or just over 59 billion in revenue. That was before the merger. 2018, 2019, once the merger had been completed and the figures for Fox were in the accounts, so included in these accounts, we see a 10 billion jump to 69.5 billion revenue. We can assume that a large proportion of that's due to the takeover, most likely. And then 2019 to 2020, which just ended, I believe, in October, their revenue was 65.3 billion. And that's obviously a year heavily affected by COVID. So in the revenue alone, we can see that there was a reasonable jump in income. I believe that mainly came from the TV networks. Obviously, Fox mainly had a TV network and a film studio. They did have some other small assets like theatres, but generally it was a small portfolio. It didn't really add much to the value of a company, so it wasn't a major issue during COVID. So all in all, though, a reasonable jump for the amount of money paid in revenue. One would hope that that would then feed into net income. So let's move on to net income. And the net income, or effectively profit, I believe, if you're a UK viewer, was 13.066 billion in 2017-2018. So again, before Fox became part of Disney, they made 13 billion profit. In 2018-2019, including Fox's figures, they had a reduction to 11.5 billion. So unfortunately, that revenue didn't necessarily equate to increased profit for that year, but that wouldn't be necessarily unusual. There's going to be a load of costs involved with the takeover, not just in completing the administration of the actual takeover itself, but also in job losses and downgrades and closures of areas which Disney didn't want to pursue or go further down the line with. Reorganisation effectively has probably eaten up some of the profits, especially if you've got costs of termination of employment. And then 2019-2020, net income minus 2.8 billion, obviously heavily affected with COVID. The film division effectively just didn't do a lot for that year. It did something, but given the film industry was pretty much closed down by March, there was no way for them to really reach their market, with cinemas being closed in all places around the world due to lockdown and restrictions that came in. Same's true of their theme parks. Initially, they'll have probably had a bit of a hit on people being concerned about COVID. Then you've got the lockdown and the shutdown of these theme parks. Probably not helped by the fact that they then reopened them, which would have cost them quite a bit of money, only to have to close them again. So a difficult year. Obviously, the net loss of 2.8 billion isn't particularly great, but when you look at the size of Disney and the amount of losses they must have taken with the theme parks alone, it's not as bad as one would expect. And part of that's probably offset by the TV companies. So obviously in the Fox merger, they bought most of Fox's TV assets. That was bringing in revenue, so that was probably helping push that figure up rather than down. What's that mean for the earning per share? The earning per share back in 2017-2018, before the merger, was $8.36 a share. Very robust. In 2018-2019, after the merger, it went down to $6.27, and then in this year, it's obviously, with it being a loss, it's minus $1.57. So you can see from a shareholder perspective, in the short term, it's not a particularly great situation. You've got a massive reduction in the earnings per share, and obviously that's going to reflect in the dividend, especially this year with it being a loss. Obviously, the situation this year is mainly COVID driven, I would argue. It's hard to blame that on the merger, as much as I might like to. In 2018-2019, when it was reduced to $6.27, again, that's not unusual in a takeover year. You take a short-term hit for long-term benefit. So again, that shouldn't be that disturbing to most of the shareholders. Now we come to the total assets. This is where it does get a bit more interesting. 2017-2018, Disney reported 95.9 billion in assets, effectively 100 billion in assets. after the takeover in 2018-2019, their asset value had gone up to 193 billion, near enough 194, which is a massive improvement considering you paid 71 billion and your assets have gone up by roughly about 90 billion. It implies that there's 20 billion of assets that they got there cheaper than it should. Obviously, some of those are intangible assets, so whether their value is what is declared by Disney or by Fox is open to interpretation. But given Disney's history, we'll have to go with that. Seems like a fair valuation. Now, we don't know what the situation is in 2019, 2020, and it's interesting to point out at this time that Disney did change its accounting regulations. They no longer list what total assets they've got, or at least I couldn't find it in their quarter four report. So we don't know what the assets are, and that is interesting because the next section we get to will imply that there has been a reduction in the assets, and it would be interesting to know what the reduction is. But unfortunately, we just don't have those figures. So there's a massive improvement in assets, and there's a massive improvement in revenue in the short term. So from a purely financial point of view, this looks like a reasonably successful takeover. It doesn't look amazing as such, but it looks reasonably good. The real question is how they're going to perform going forward. Obviously, COVID really throws out our ability to determine if the Fox merger's having that big an effect. But looking at these figures, it doesn't look like a bad deal at all. As I've mentioned, it cost Disney 71 billion roughly to buy Fox. But that's not entirely the full story. So if we go on to the next section is Disney disposals. You see, since they've bought Fox, they have been selling off parts of a company that they don't have a requirement of. More than I've listed here, but some of the others are relatively small in relation to the numbers we're going to discuss now. So I've kind of left them off because their significance to the bottom line is minimal, and more likely that they probably would have been a cost rather than a revenue source. So probably helps Disney to be more efficient to dispose of them. Now, their first disposal was Sky, which they sold for 15 billion, or rather Fox's old shareholding in Sky. Now, I had thought, and I've said in one of my football videos, that this money went to Murdoch. It turns out it didn't. Unfortunately, the wonderful, reliable Wikipedia, or not reliable as it's become, it seems to have, in some of the articles, seemed to have counted it going to Murdoch, seems to have counted it going to Disney. When I actually looked into it, it went to Disney. Basically, they got the 15 billion that the Murdochs negotiated. That immediately went into their coffers once Comcast completed the takeover. So there's 15 billion straight away off that 71 billion that they paid. They also had to sell Fox Sports Networks, which they did for 10 billion. Another nice little income source. So again, with those two sales, they've brought in 25 billion cash. They also sold the Yes Network, which I believe is the Yankees, a baseball club. The TV rights to that, they sold that for 3.5 billion. And then they sold Endemol Shine Group, which is responsible for, well, in the UK, would recognise it for Big Brother, but kind of reality TV shows, and I think it does quiz shows as well. They sold that for a further 1.1 billion. They still have, I think it's a 50% stake in A+E Networks, which is roughly expected to be worth about 10 billion. Now, due to the restrictions placed on the merger, they do have to sell this asset off. The obvious place to sell it is to the company that owns the other 50%. However, whether that will affect the price that they command, I don't know. But I don't think it would be unreasonable to expect a further 10 billion coming in from that disposal. They have to make that disposal, I believe, as part of the agreement for the merger, so I'd expect that to come sometime in the future. It may be held up due to the fact that if the other company has to raise finances through banking, that could be difficult at the moment, so there might be a delay there on that basis. Equally, they might not want to pay the 10 billion price because with COVID, expectations are that advertising revenues are going to fall quite significantly in the next year or two, or they're actually falling now if we look at YouTube and other areas where they're desperately trying to make up that revenue by increasing the amount of the ads going out there and presumably cutting the cost of advertising. They may say, well, it's worth 10 billion today, but is it going to be worth 10 billion in 2 years' time? So you may find that they negotiate quite strongly to bring that figure down, but we'll have to wait and see. So that effectively means that the cost of a Fox merger was 71 billion. It's since sold assets from that merger for 30 billion, and that's not including the 10 million that can be expected for A&E, so that's just what they have sold, which means that the actual cost of a Fox merger wasn't 71 billion, but so far is 41 billion. Could be reduced to 31 billion if that sale goes through for A&E. It's a lot cheaper merger than I thought, and there's a definite benefit for Disney in the fact that it sold these assets, as it's actually given them cash flow to use now. Those, I think one of them, that they sold for 10 billion, that money has come in after COVID has occurred, and they've decided to hold that cash in reserve for obvious reasons. So now they have got cash flow to try and deal with the COVID situation. So it's kind of given them a bit of breathing room. If we look at this, which I've pulled off Google, debt overview by Benzinga, I'm not sure who they are, but first thing came up in Google, and the figures look good to me, so I'm going to go with it. They're saying that the total debt that Disney have is 64.42 billion. 54 billion of that in long-term debt, so probably relating to the Fox takeover, and 10.2 billion in current debt, which I think is short-term loans that they've taken when COVID started up, possibly before they'd received the 10 billion incoming from disposals, so something that kind of bridged the gap for that period. So they're saying effectively they've got about 23 billion in cash at the moment. That has actually reduced since they've reported. I think it's taken about 5 billion off, so they're around about the 17 billion in cash at the moment. But on the figures we've got in front of us, that would bring their debt down to 40.31 billion, which, as I just said, is the cost of a Fox takeover. So their cash position returns them to a point where all they've got on the books is 41 billion from the Fox takeover. So massive reduction down from 70 billion, although I think they only did take out the 64 billion. I think they had 10 billion cash, as I remember. We've got the debt figuring up nicely with what I've written, is slightly more than at debt at the moment, because like I say, 5 million will have to go on to that, so their net debt's probably at this time 46 billion. And to be fair, in line with A, the assets they have, B, the value of the company, and C, their revenue. I mean, their revenue is equivalent to their total debt, or actually, if you look at the net debt, the total revenue is more than their net debt. So it's not a terrible position to be in at all. Obviously, you want the profit to be up there, but if they were making, 10 billion, as they had the previous 2 years, they could probably pay off that debt in 4 years. So it's not that big an issue, debt-wise. But on to the secret surprise I found in Disney's purchase, Hulu. A lot of people said the main reason for buying Fox was to get control of Hulu. What I'm going to show you now does kind of suggest that may well have been the case. I mean, obviously there's also the back catalogue of Fox, which would be quite a nice little asset. There's the fact that they can merge in characters from the Marvel universe. That may have been a factor. I don't think it was really a major factor in this. I think that was just really a sideshow. I think the real issue was they wanted to go the Disney Plus route. They wanted to start taking on Netflix, and Hulu was a main target for that. Now what we've got here is Hulu's figures for subscriptions and the cost. If you look, we've got 29th of December 2018, before Disney took over, but they did give figures for subscribers and revenue per subscriber in their annual results. This one, I think 29th of December would have been their first quarterly results under the new accounting system, so it's not an end of year. This is effectively a first quarter under new accounting rules, or I think it's the estimate they give you under the accounting rules, because I think 28th December 2019 was actually when they moved to the new accounting rules for the first quarter for 2020. And then finally, I've got 3rd of October 2020, which is their annual results, their year end. Obviously, that's not comparable with 28th of December. That we've got to come, and that will be a more year-on-year figure. So do be aware that the 3rd of October isn't a full year, but as we're talking about paid subscribers, it shouldn't really matter. Back in December 2018, when Disney and Fox hadn't merged, they had 21.1 subscription video on demand customers, and they also had 1.7 million video on demand or subscription video on demand plus live TV customers. Now obviously there's been a steady progression, so 28th of December, the video on demand customers 27.2 million, live TV 3.2 million, so quite a big jump. Then we've got the most recent set of results, 32.5 million subscribers in October, video on demand plus live TV 4.1 million. I would say there does seem to be seasonal fluctuations with these figures, so there seems to be a bigger take-up of subscriptions in the winter months, so October, November, December, the kind of holiday period. And then in the summer period, there seems to be less growth, or the value of the subscriptions or the value that they're getting from each subscriber seems to drop. So there does seem to be some fluctuation like that. But what we're seeing here is obviously steady growth from the subscription side under Disney's ownership. I mean, they've effectively added on 11 million subscribers on their subscription video on demand, and they've more than doubled the live TV subscribers, which is quite impressive. It's especially impressive considering when you look at the average monthly revenue per subscriber. So in 2018 for video on demand it was $14.49. Again in 28th December 2019 it was $13.15. 3rd of October 2020 video on demand $12.59. So yes, there's a drop in the value or how much they're making per customer. Like I say, that may well be seasonal. One, because of big releases, so if you're releasing Avengers Infinity War, you tend to be doing it at a certain point in the year. That may drive up the amount that you're earning per subscriber, because you may be offering them, hey, pay £5 and you can rent this for the night. So things like that will make it a very flexible figure. More interestingly is the video on, or subscription video on demand and live TV. Now, when I first saw this figure of $52.31, I thought, oh, that's got to be for the year. But no, that's a monthly fee that they're charging. And from what I can determine, it's effectively you get access to the subscription video on demand, like the people paying the lesser amount, but you also get a subscription package to TV channels like you would from a Sky or cable company, whereby you'll get 50, 60, 70 channels. They don't own all the channels, but they're effectively selling you all the channels in a package. So effectively packaged TV would be the way I'd think of that. Now it's interesting because it starts off at $52.31 a month in December 2018 before Disney takes over. And their first account's in charge of it. That price has gone up to $59.47. This is a fixed fee subscription service, so that really reflects an increase in pricing on the packages that they're offering. It's not driven, I suspect, by extra purchases. It's more driven by the fact that this package has gone up in price. And this is something that Clownfish TV have often mentioned, that since Disney has taken over, the price of Hulu has just been going up and up. And if we move to October 2020, the most recent reports, that figure is up to $71.90 a month. So that's what, an extra $11 since, well, not even the year before, since 9 months before. And I believe there's another price hike to come. That figure should go up a bit further. The question is, for Disney, how far can they push that figure? If they're including things like Disney Plus, that might push it a bit higher. But then if you're getting Disney Plus as well, maybe the value is there to justify that price hike. There is going to be a breaking point for the live TV. At this point, they can probably justify it, but I think they'll struggle to go much higher. Also, with the economic situation eventually going to come home to roost in a lot of places, you may find that the marketplace doesn't have as much free income to spend as it did previously, and you may see subscriptions being cancelled at that point. So we'll have to wait and see. But all of these figures, when you look at them, do point to one very clear thing, and that is Hulu brings in an amazing amount of revenue. And to show you that, I've made a quick calculation. What I've done is I've taken some of the lesser figures, so 27.2 million subscribers. That's where they were at the beginning or at the end of their 2019 year, coming into the 2020 year. I've taken the lowest valuation for the video on demand, the most recent one, so it should be a conservative figure, and I've multiplied it by 12, because obviously that $12.59 is a monthly figure. Maybe it should be 13 if they work on a 4-week month. I'm going with 12 again, keeping it relatively conservative. So just for the subscription video on demand subscribers, they've got 4.1 billion in revenue, not profit, in revenue. So just those alone are bringing in 4 billion. If we look at the live subscription TV package, and here I've used the 2019 subscriber figures, so it's what they had at the same time as they had 27.2 million subscribers. I've taken the same year's subscription or monthly subscription value, and again I've multiplied it by 12, and from that we can determine that over the year the live subscription package brings in a further 2.2 billion. So if we add those both together, we get a nice round sum of 6.3 billion revenue, and that is conservative. Obviously the amount they're charging per subscriber in both of those cases has gone up, so we can expect it to go up considerably. They've also increased the number of subscribers attached to the system, so again we can see that figure going up. For 2020, for this year gone, we could be seeing as much as 7, maybe even 8 billion in revenue coming from Hulu, and that's quite a major income stream considering we were just saying that the revenue that Fox brought in of 10 billion, Hulu itself now is getting close to that figure. So Hulu has been a superb buy in many respects. There is the question of cost. How much is it costing them to put out the programming on Hulu? I mean, to some extent, it's already built in. Some of it will come from the other networks that they own. Some of it actually comes from the other Hulu shareholder. Who is the other? It's not Comcast. I think it's NBC Universal is the other 30% shareholder who have agreed to sell their stake by 2024. But they're still providing content to Hulu. Obviously, they're also getting 30% of presumably the profits. That's obviously going to end, so once that ends, Hulu is going to have to be catered for solely by Disney. Disney will have to put the output. But for the time being, they're sharing it with Universal, NBC Universal, I believe it is. And that seems to work quite well for Disney. A lot of people have been saying, yeah, Hulu, they're going to close Hulu down. Look at these figures. I don't know if they will. I think Hulu is possibly going to be brought more in-house. So Disney Plus and Hulu may be two separate services. Disney more for the children or for the family-orientated, Hulu more for the grown-ups. This is one of the things that was said about this takeover. This takeover wasn't really about increasing the revenue, as I showed earlier. It was about getting a foothold in the streaming market by increasing the amount of content and the amount of back catalogue you've got to offer customers in a streaming service. Hulu is part of a delivery system, it would seem to me, so I don't think they will dispose of Hulu. I think they will quite happily keep growing it as is and run it along Disney, and once 2024 comes along, it's probably going to come into house and be part of the Disney package, which will include Hulu, ESPN. I mean, effectively they're already bundling it. That's one of the reasons they're saying that the subscription price per customer on many of their subscription services like Disney Plus, like ESPN, is dropping because they're bundling it with more packages to offer greater value. I think that's pretty much the way they're going with it. You've got Hulu for adult content, ESPN for your sports content, and Disney Plus for your family content. Maybe an argument that Disney Plus was going to be for their film content, but the state of the film industry, who knows if that will be the case going forward. Now, looking at these figures, let's compare it to Disney Plus, because one of the other things that people have been saying is Disney Plus is saving Disney. And here we're actually using their best figures. For Disney Plus, well, I say the best figures. We're using the latest quarter. So quarter 4, October, 73.7 million users of Disney Plus. They're actually getting a per user subscription value of $4.52 per customer per month. That is massively down. It started off at about $5. Again, we're into that question of the discounting with bundles and the discounting through other offers. But if we add all those figures together, then if Disney maintain those figures for the next year, they'd bring in just shy of 4 billion. Let's call it 4 billion. Somebody will probably put in the extra to make it up. So let's call it 4 billion. Yeah, it's not done bad, but it's not done as well as Hulu. And yeah, it's its first year. There's a lot of promotions. I think equally though, you may see that Disney will start to, if not drop a little, maybe see those figures stagnate, especially after the 1 year anniversary, because I think if people have signed up for a 1 year subscription, they've seen everything on the platform. One of the big issues I think Disney has going forward is lack of content. They've entered this market, but they haven't really got the content to do it. Even with what we've seen being announced through Disney, that isn't sufficient material really to run a streaming service. I mean, when you consider Netflix signs people up for 10 series in a row or 5 series in a row, they are pushing out content at an extremely stupid speed. Now, whether all that content's good, yeah, we know it's not. But there's enough in there to justify the cost. And sometimes you get something that's really good and that probably leads to having a little bit of a profit in the short term. But they're getting the content out there. They're basically giving the customer base, hey, here's more content, here's a reason to keep the subscription going. Whereas Disney, even opening up, now you can watch Home Alone. Well, I've seen Home Alone. I saw Home Alone 20 years ago. I suppose for the young kids, fine. But for most of the population, they've seen Home Alone. So when you add the Fox back catalogue to what Disney has, it's a lot of films that everyone's already seen. Die Hard, seen it. Alien, seen it. Predator, seen it. Equally, with a lot of those, I've got most of those on DVD. I can pick them out, play them when I want. So it doesn't add that much of a draw as compared to Netflix, who are like, hey, we've got all this content. I mean, even now, if I've never seen Netflix, so if I was to subscribe to Netflix, I've got, 10 years of Netflix material to go through, which I've never seen. Some of it I've heard of, some of it I haven't, but I haven't seen any of it really, unless it's been released on other channels outside of Netflix, which I don't believe it has, then I haven't seen it. Whereas Disney catalogue, I've seen it all. I've seen everything. One thing I haven't seen is Mandalorian, or the Star Wars Disney movies. Well, I saw 75% of Rogue One. That's literally all I've seen of Disney Star Wars. That's all I needed to see of Disney Star Wars. So yeah, the Mandalorian isn't a draw for me. It looks nice. It sounds like a good premise. I mean, I've seen Lone Wolf and Cub many times in many forms now. I don't know. If it's not George Lucas, it's not Star Wars. It's that simple, really, when it comes down to it. Maybe that's why the Mandalorian is receiving better views, maybe because George Lucas is there to say, hey, X, Y, Z. Maybe that makes it better, makes it fit within the Star Wars universe. I don't know. I'm speaking out my hat because I've not seen any of it, so what do I know? But that is really, I think, the issue there for both Hulu and for Disney Plus is content. So in summary, the takeover of Fox by Disney was not only a relatively good takeover, it saved Disney by taking out those debts to purchase Fox. They created a debt facility at a cheaper price than they would currently get now or at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And all they needed to do to utilise that was to sell the assets off that, to a large extent, they had to comply with the merger ruling. Basically got rid of what they didn't want or couldn't have, brought in a load of cash, and now they're sitting on that, and they've got probably 5 years cash reserves if they mothball the operations like the parks, like the films. Obviously the films, if you're letting people go because they're not on a long-term contract, they're only on the contract for the film. So when the film ends, that's it, no extra payments. Off you go and find a job. So there's relatively cheap basis for putting the films on the back burner. Don't know if that's quite the same for the parks. I suspect there'll be a number of staff who've been there considerable time who will have certain bites, but we'll have to wait and see. But I would imagine most of the park staff are going to be laid off in the short term or furloughed, if that's still an option in America. So all that being said, if they do that, push forward on Disney Plus and the streaming services, Hulu, and obviously their network, they should be able to keep their head above water, hopefully even make profits this year coming, which wasn't necessarily what I wanted to say. So in terms of financial requirements, the merger was a success. In terms of what it was aiming to achieve, which was to have content for their streaming service going forward, that's more dubious. And given the fact that, as I'm recording this, Disney have just released a lot of information on what they're doing going forward, I'm going to stop it here and do a separate one covering that area because I think realistically we've established the takeover benefited Disney quite considerably. So this argument's over. But there is another aspect that I didn't get to cover, but will probably better covered in a different way.